Grace Parker didn't walk into Keystone Federal looking for a miracle. She walked in because her baby was coughing so hard she could hear his breath scraping, and the cold outside was no longer survivable. In her pocket was a corroded brass token, the kind of object banks usually laugh at, the kind security guards quietly escort you out for showing. She was homeless, exhausted, and already preparing herself to be turned away one more time. What she didn't know was that the moment that token touched the counter, a chain reaction decades in the making would begin, one that would pit her against powerful bankers, expose an old family vendetta, and force her to defend not just a fortune, but her right to dignity. This is not a fairy tale about getting rich overnight. It's a story about survival, pride, and what happens when the past reaches forward to pull someone out of the cold while others try to push her back into it. Before we begin, please let us know where you're listening from or how you're feeling right now, or simply write Amen for everything that truly matters. And if this story touches your heart, please follow the channel for more stories of courage, resilience, and quiet justice. Your support truly means a great deal to us. Grace Parker had stopped thinking of winter as a season. In Northeast cities, winter was a verdict. It wasn't just cold, it was sharp, a thing with teeth that found the smallest gaps in your coat and bit until your bones felt hollow. For 3 weeks, Grace had lived with that bite. She learned which subway grates exhaled warmth and which ones were guarded by police who pretended not to see you until they decided they did. She learned which diner would let you sit with one coffee for an hour if your hands shook hard enough to make the cup rattle. She learned the humiliating arithmetic of survival. One child's hunger plus one child's sickness equals a mother's fear turned physical, a rock lodged under the ribs. Grace was 32 and looked older in the mirror of a public restroom than she ever had on her wedding day. Her hair, once a chestnut brown she wore loose, was now pulled into a messy knot that never stayed put. Because she didn't have a brush, because the wind kept tearing loose strands and whipping them across her cheeks like thin lashes. Her skin had gone sallow from too little sleep and too few meals. The bridge of her nose had a faint red scrape where a cheap mask had chafed her for days. But the eyes were what did it. Gray-green, wide, always scanning. She could be standing still and still look like she was bracing for impact. It wasn't paranoia. It was practice. There was a time close enough to hurt, far enough to feel like someone else's life, when Grace had a small apartment with a door that locked and a kitchen that smelled like butter in the evenings. She worked the front desk at a dental office, not glamorous work but steady. She could tell you which patients wanted friendly chatter and which ones wanted silence. She kept her nails short and clean, her smile ready. She and her husband, Evan Parker, had a habit of leaving sticky notes for each other on the fridge. Pick up milk. Love you. Don't forget your lunch. Evan had a mechanic's hands, broad palms, nicked knuckles, a few old scars that told stories he never bragged about. He was the sort of man who talked to strangers like they mattered. It was the way he'd been raised, he told her once, by a grandfather who believed manners were a kind of shelter. Then, 18 months ago, a rain-slick road and a driver who couldn't stop in time took Evan out of the world with the same indifference the city used to step over sleeping bodies. The hospital bills came fast, thick as snow. Even with insurance, the numbers kept climbing like they were chasing her. Grace sold what she could. She worked extra shifts until her face felt stapled into a smile. She was pregnant then, carrying her son, Noah. She kept telling herself there would be a bottom to it, a place where the fall ended and you could stand up again. But the company downsized right after her maternity leave ended. No severance, just an email and a meeting with a manager who wouldn't meet her eyes. The eviction notice followed. Friends helped at first casseroles, a few nights on couches, but need has a way of wearing out even love. Grace watched invitations slow, then stop. She watched her name become a burden people handled gently, like something hot. 3 weeks ago she had stepped outside with a diaper bag and 2 children and nowhere to go. That morning the city was white and hard. Snow had crusted into ridges along the sidewalks and turned to gray slush where boots had ground it down. the air smelled like exhaust and salt. Grace sat with her back against a brick wall that radiated nothing but cold. Noah pressed to her chest beneath her thin coat. Lily crouched close beside her, knees tucked in and arms wrapped around herself like a small animal trying to conserve heat. Lily was 8 and had her father's dark lashes and her mother's stubborn chin. Her hair, a dark honey brown, was braided in 2 uneven plaits Grace had done with numb fingers in a library bathroom the night before. The ends frayed, not from fashion, but from neglect. Lily tried to be quiet about her hunger. Grace could always tell when it got bad. Lily's questions would come in whispers, as if hunger might get angry if you named it aloud. Noah's cough had started as a little rattle 2 days earlier. Now it sounded like sandpaper dragged across glass. Each burst made his small body jerk in Grace's arms, and afterward he'd wheeze as if the air itself had become heavy. Noah was 14 months old, soft-cheeked, usually quick with a gummy smile. This morning his cheeks were flushed and his eyes looked too bright, too watery. When he coughed, he made a thin, frightened noise at the end, like he didn't understand why his own chest was betraying him. Grace tried to rock him, tried to make her body a wall between him and the wind. But the wind had time. The wind always won if you let it. She dug into her purse, a threadbare thing with a broken zipper she'd carried since the days she still had a key ring and a schedule. Her fingers found lint, a crumpled receipt, a pack of wipes, 2 pennies, and a quarter. Not enough for anything. Not enough for a cup of hot water in a place that charged for the privilege of sitting inside. She kept digging anyway, because mothers do that. They dig into emptiness and pretend it might be full if they're stubborn enough. And then her fingertips hit metal. Not a coin. Too large. Too cold. Too heavy in a way that made her breath catch. Grace pulled it out slowly, half expecting it to be something she'd stolen in a sleep-deprived haze and forgotten about. But it was familiar the way a childhood bruise is familiar. It fit her palm like a secret. A brass token rectangular, a little larger than a credit card, dulled by time. The edges were worn smooth. Greenish oxidation spidered across the surface like old moss. Strange symbols and numbers were etched into it, not modern branding, not anything that belonged to the sleek world of tap-to-pay and digital wallets. It looked like something from another era, when banking felt like vaults and handshakes instead of apps and passwords. Grace stared at it while Noah's cough rattled again. Walter Bennett. Her grandfather's face rose in her mind with startling clarity, a tall, spare man with silver hair combed back neat, a lined face that always looked like it had listened to more than it spoke. Walter had pale blue eyes that could be gentle or sharp, depending on whether you were lying to him. He lived in a small house, drove an old sedan, drank coffee that tasted like it had been boiled for an hour. He smelled of cedar and peppermint and, in winter, wood smoke. He was the kind of old man who could win at chess with 3 pieces and a smirk. Grace had been 10 when he taught her to stop panicking at the board. "Don't stare at what you're losing," he'd said, tapping a knuckle against the table. "Stare at what you're protecting." He had quit cigarettes years before she was old enough to know what they were, but his laugh still had that rough warmth, like gravel softened by water. On one of those Sundays, after she'd complained that the game was unfair because he'd had a lifetime of practice, Walter had reached into his coat pocket and set the brass token on the table with a soft, final clink. "This is for you, Gracie," he'd said. She'd turned it over, puzzled by its weight, the unfamiliar carvings. "What is it?" "Insurance," he replied, and his smile had faded into something more serious. "Insurance for what?" "For the day life pushes you into a hole so deep you can't climb out." He had leaned forward, eyes steady. "This will be the rope, but you only use it if you truly believe there's still a way out." Grace had laughed then because 10-year-olds don't believe in permanent collapse. 10-year-olds believe adults are invincible and homes don't disappear. She'd tucked the token away in a drawer and forgotten it the way you forget umbrellas and warnings. Now it sat in her palm like a pulse. Lily looked up at her mother's face and saw something shift. "Mom?" Grace swallowed. Her throat burned, dry from cold air and unshed tears. "We're going somewhere," she said, forcing her voice to sound like certainty instead of prayer. "Where?" Lily asked. Her breath made a little cloud. Grace looked down at Noah's flushed face, at the way his small fingers curled weakly into her shirt. She couldn't let his lungs keep fighting the cold on the sidewalk. She couldn't wait for a shelter bed that might never come. She couldn't count on luck anymore. "To a bank," she said, and felt ridiculous even as she said it. Lily blinked. "Like a money bank?" Grace almost smiled. "Almost. Like a big one." She stood, legs stiff, joints protesting. She shifted Noah higher on her hip, adjusted the diaper bag strap that kept slipping, and took Lily's hand. Lily's glove was too thin. Her hand inside it felt like a bird's. Grace squeezed gently, like she could send warmth through skin and bone just by trying hard enough. They walked. Past the slush, past storefronts glittering with warm lights that made the cold feel personal. Past people who glanced and then looked away fast, as if homelessness were contagious. Grace kept her chin up, because she had learned that predators of all kinds target the bowed head. Keystone Federal rose out of the street like an accusation. Granite gray stone, tall windows, brass doors that gleamed even under the dull winter sky, polished to a shine that seemed to say, "This place is for people who belong." Grace paused at the bottom of the steps. Her reflection warped in the brass, a thin woman with a bundled baby and a little girl with split seams in her shoes, a woman who looked like she had been erased by weather. For a moment, doubt crept in, cold and familiar. "They'll stop you. They'll call security. They'll treat you like you're trying to steal warmth." Noah coughed again, hard, wet, desperate. The sound cut through her doubt like a knife. Grace tightened her grip on Lily's hand and climbed the steps. Each step felt like stepping into someone else's world. Each step felt like an argument with fate. At the top, she pressed her palm against the brass door. It was warmed by the building's heat, by money, by the comfort of people inside who didn't know what it was to have their child's health depend on spare change. Grace pushed. The door gave way. A blast of heated air hit her face so suddenly she swayed. It smelled like clean marble and expensive cologne and something faintly floral. The lobby stretched wide, shining. Men and women moved across it in tailored coats, polished shoes clicking sharply on stone. Conversations hummed like background music. Grace stepped inside and felt every eye that turned. Not all of them. Most people were too busy being important, but enough. The awareness crawled over her skin like ants. She could almost hear what they were thinking. Why is she here? Who let her in? She held Noah tighter. She kept Lily close. She felt the brass token in her pocket like the last match in a storm. And she walked forward anyway, straight into the light, because she had finally reached the point Walter Bennett had warned her about, the hole so deep you stop pretending you're not falling. If this token was a rope, she was going to throw it upward with both hands and pray there was still something solid above. The warmth of the bank lobby hit Grace Parker so suddenly it made her dizzy. It wasn't just heat, it was excess air thick with comfort, polished marble holding warmth the way stone holds memory. The soundscape felt unreal after the street, the soft click of leather soles, the low murmur of practiced voices, the faint, expensive sweetness of perfume that lingered without asking permission. Grace took 2 steps inside Keystone Federal and felt as though she had crossed an invisible border where she no longer spoke the language. She was stopped almost immediately. The man who stepped into her path was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark navy uniform stretched cleanly across a body built more for confrontation than conversation. His name badge read Hank Miller. He had a square jaw with faint gray stubble shadowing it, the kind of face that had learned long ago how to look authoritative without raising its voice. His eyes flicked over Grace quickly. Coat too thin, shoes worn smooth, a baby bundled against her chest, then moved to Lily, lingering just long enough to register concern before discipline shut it down. Beside him stood Denise Cole, lean and sharp, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun that didn't allow for rebellion. Her skin was pale, almost porcelain, and her eyes were narrow and precise, like she catalogued threats for a living. One hand rested casually near the radio clipped at her shoulder, fingers brushing it the way some people touched a rosary. Denise didn't scowl. She didn't need to. Her stillness did the work. "Ma'am," Hank said, his voice firm but not loud. "Can I help you with something?" Grace shifted Noah slightly, feeling the heat of his small body through her coat. His breathing was uneven, shallow between coughs. "I need to check on an account," she said. She kept her tone level. Begging never helped. "I was told to come here." Denise's eyes dropped to Grace's hands. "Do you have identification?" Grace's throat tightened. Her wallet was light in a way that had stopped surprising her. "I don't," she said honestly, "but I have this." She reached into her pocket and drew out the brass token. The metal looked even more out of place under the lobby lights, its greenish oxidation dull against the bank's shine. Denise's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. Hank took the token between thumb and forefinger, turning it once, then again. His brow creased. "This isn't one of ours," Denise said flatly. "If you're looking for assistance, there's a community center 3 blocks east. They open at noon." Grace felt Lily's fingers curl tighter around hers. She took a breath she couldn't afford to waste. "Please," she said, not pleading, not loud, just steady. "My grandfather's name was Walter Bennett. He told me to bring this here if things ever got bad." The name hung between them. Hank's expression shifted, just a fraction. He glanced at Denise, who lifted an eyebrow slightly, skeptical but listening. Noah coughed again, deep, wet, frightening, and Grace instinctively rocked him, murmuring nonsense words she hoped sounded like comfort. "Wait here," Hank said finally. "Don't approach other customers." They were guided to a seating area off to the side, near a massive potted plant whose leaves shone with artificial health. Grace sat carefully, as if afraid the chair might reject her. Lily perched beside her, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the polished floor. Minutes stretched. Noah's cough worsened, each spasm followed by a thin whine that cut through Grace's composure like wire. "I'm hungry," Lily whispered, shame coloring her voice. "I know," Grace said softly. She hated the hollow sound of promises she wasn't sure she could keep. She hated that her daughter had learned to whisper needs. As if summoned by the sound of the cough, an elderly woman stopped in front of them. She was elegantly dressed, her camel hair coat tailored and pristine, silver hair swept into a soft wave that framed a face lined but serene. She smelled faintly of lavender and soap. Her eyes, dark, observant, took in Noah's flushed cheeks, the way Grace held him too tightly. "How old is he?" the woman asked gently. 14 months, Grace replied, surprised into answering. The woman reached into her purse and pressed a folded bill into Grace's hand before she could refuse. "Get him something warm," she said, "before it gets worse." Then, as quietly as she had appeared, she was gone, absorbed back into the flow of wealth and purpose. Grace stared at the bill, a mix of gratitude and humiliation burning behind her eyes. She hadn't cried in weeks. She wasn't about to start now. When Hank returned, he didn't look at the token again. "Someone will see you," he said. "Please follow me." They moved past a set of elevators that didn't have visible buttons, through a corridor paneled in dark wood where the air smelled faintly of polish and old paper. The carpet was thick, swallowing sound. Grace had the strange sensation of being carried backward through time, into a version of the bank that remembered when money moved slower and secrets were kept behind doors instead of screens. In a small conference room waited a man who rose as they entered. Richard Hale was in his late 50s, tall but slightly stooped, as if years of responsibility had pressed down on his spine. His head was bald, his face narrow, with a neatly trimmed gray beard that softened features otherwise sharp with discipline. His suit was conservative, charcoal gray, the kind chosen by someone who preferred stability over fashion. "Ms. Parker," he said, offering a nod rather than a handshake, his eyes already on the brass token. "I'm Richard Hale. I oversee legacy accounts." Grace sat on the edge of the leather chair, Lily beside her, Noah heavy in her arms. She felt like a smudge on expensive glass. "You presented this at reception," Richard said, gesturing to the token now resting on the table between them. "May I ask how it came into your possession?" "My grandfather gave it to me," Grace said. "Walter Bennett." Richard's eyes flickered, not surprise exactly, but recognition. "I see." He folded his hands. "Before we proceed, I need to ask a few questions. Your current circumstances?" Grace swallowed. "We're homeless," she said. The word still burned. "My husband died. I lost my job. We've been on the street for 3 weeks." Richard nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had long suspected. "And you believe this token represents what, exactly?" "I don't know," Grace said. "He said it was insurance, that it was a rope." Richard stood. "Then we need to verify your identity." He pressed a button on the wall. A young woman entered carrying a tablet and a small biometric scanner. Mia Chin couldn't have been more than 28. She had straight black hair cut just below her jaw, skin the warm tone of polished wood, and eyes that missed very little. She moved with professional calm, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her gaze as she looked at Grace, not judgment, just interest. "If you'll place your index finger here," Mia said gently. Grace did. The scanner hummed. The room seemed to hold its breath. A soft chime sounded. Mia's eyebrows lifted before she smoothed her expression. "It's a match," she said. Richard exhaled. Not relief. Something closer to gravity settling into place. "Thank you, Mia." When they were alone again, Richard's posture changed. The distance in his eyes receded, replaced by something almost human. "Ms. Parker," he said carefully, "your grandfather established what we refer to internally as a contingency trust. It was designed to activate only under very specific conditions." "What conditions?" Grace asked, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Verified lineage," Richard said, "and verified destitution." Grace stared at him. "You're saying he planned for this?" "Yes." Richard's voice was steady, but his eyes softened. "The Bennett Contingency Trust has been managed quietly for decades. Its current valuation is—" He paused, as if measuring the impact. "Substantial." Grace didn't hear the number. She heard the echo of her own thoughts from hours earlier. 1 cup of tea, 1 night of warmth, 1 more chance to keep her children breathing. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "He lived in a small house. He clipped coupons." "He was deliberate," Richard said. "About everything." At that moment, the door opened again. A staff member entered carrying a tray, sandwiches, fruit, bottled water. Lily's eyes widened. Noah coughed, then quieted, his body sagging with exhaustion. "Please," Richard said, gesturing. "Your children need food. We can talk after." Grace hesitated, caught between disbelief and instinct. Then Lily reached for a sandwich with shaking hands, and the world narrowed back to what mattered. As she watched her daughter eat, Richard leaned forward. "Miss Parker," he said, "there are arrangements to be made, immediate ones. Medical care for your son, a place for you to stay tonight." Grace looked up. "Why?" she asked. "Why help us?" Richard's gaze dropped briefly to the brass token. "Because your grandfather anticipated this moment," he said, "and because he was very clear about one thing." He met her eyes. "When she comes, don't let the system break her further." Grace felt something inside her chest crack. Not break, but open. She clutched Noah closer, as if afraid that if she let go, the floor might vanish again. She didn't yet know that this room was the threshold, or that beyond it waited both salvation and scrutiny. She only knew that for the first time in weeks, someone had looked at her and seen not a problem to be removed, but a story that had been waiting to be told. And somewhere, deep beneath the bank, a vault that had been closed for decades had just begun to wake. The hotel suite felt unreal in the way silence can feel unreal after months of noise. It was too large, too clean, too warm. The carpet swallowed the sound of Grace Parker's footsteps as she moved from room to room, half expecting someone to appear and tell her there had been a mistake. Lily laughed the moment she saw the bed, an unrestrained, bubbling sound that startled Grace with its brightness. Lily bounced once, then again, as if testing whether joy was still allowed. Noah slept in her arms, his breathing no longer ragged, his small chest rising and falling with a rhythm Grace had been terrified she might lose. A doctor arrived within the hour. Dr. Evan Morales was in his early 40s, lean, with tired eyes and a calm voice that suggested long nights and difficult cases. His hair was dark with a premature thread of gray at the temples, his beard trimmed close. He handled Noah gently, listening, watching, asking careful questions. When he straightened, he didn't dramatize. He didn't soften the truth either. "Bronchitis," he said. "Early, but we caught it. Antibiotics should help quickly. Warmth, fluids, rest." He met Grace's gaze. "You did the right thing bringing him in." Grace nodded, gripping the edge of the crib that had appeared as if summoned. The relief hit her late, like a wave she didn't see coming. She thanked him more times than necessary. When the door closed behind him, she pressed her forehead briefly against the wall and let herself breathe. On the coffee table lay a thick manila envelope. Inside, a letter in a familiar hand waited. Walter Bennett's handwriting had always been precise, each letter shaped as if it mattered. The Grace read slowly, then again, then a third time, the words threading themselves into her chest. He wrote of hunger and benches and being unseen. He wrote of choosing modesty, not because he despised wealth, but because he feared its ability to hollow people out. He wrote that the trust was not a prize, but a guardrail, a way back to the road when the ditch was deep. "Don't let money make you forget people," he wrote. "Let it help you remember them." Grace folded the letter and set it back in the envelope with hands that trembled less than they had in weeks. Morning came softly. Sunlight spilled through tall windows and painted pale gold across the floor. Lily woke with questions tumbling out of her mouth, eyes bright, hair tangled into hopeful knots. Noah woke hungry, then fell asleep again after feeding, his cough already less insistent. Grace stood at the window and watched the city from a height she hadn't known in years, the streets below covered in a clean layer of snow that made everything look briefly forgiven. At 9, a knock came. The man who entered introduced himself with a warm, measured smile. Aidan Brooks was in his early 30s, tall and slender, with sandy hair neatly combed and a face that suggested patience rather than ambition. His suit was charcoal and unremarkable, chosen to disappear rather than impress. When he spoke, it was with an ease that didn't rush Grace or fill silences to assert control. He shook her hand lightly, then crouched to Lily's height, asking her about the view, asking Noah nothing at all. "I'm here to help you with the practical things," Aidan said once they were seated. "Only what you need right now. We can talk about the rest later." He didn't open with numbers. He opened with questions. Did Grace want to stay in the city or move somewhere quieter? He wrote notes carefully, listening more than he spoke. Grace surprised herself by answering without apology. "I want something small," she said. "Safe, close to a park, somewhere that feels believable." They drove later that afternoon. Aidan had arranged a car, nothing sleek, nothing ostentatious. A practical SUV with a child seat already installed. The driver kept to himself. Grace watched the neighborhood slide past, each street a measure of possibility. When they reached Maple Street, she felt something loosen inside her chest. The house was modest. A 2-bedroom Cape Cod with a sloped roof and pale siding, a small fenced yard dusted with snow. The porch light was old but sturdy, the steps worn by years of use. Inside, the rooms were empty but warm, sunlight falling across hardwood floors that bore small, honest scratches. Lily spun in the living room, arms out, as if testing the space for echoes. Noah crawled on the rug, reaching toward the bright rectangle of sun, fascinated by dust motes. "This is it," Grace said before she realized she'd spoken aloud. Aiden raised an eyebrow gently. "You know you could choose." "I know," Grace said. "I don't want to feel like I'm waiting to wake up." They moved quickly, but not carelessly. Beds arrived that same day. Basic furniture. Groceries stocked the kitchen with foods Grace hadn't seen in months. Grace cooked pasta and watched Lily eat without counting bites. She tucked Noah into a crib that didn't wobble. She slept that night on a mattress that didn't smell like the street, waking twice out of habit, then falling back asleep when she remembered where she was. The following days took on a rhythm. School enrollment paperwork, pediatric follow-ups, a haircut that felt like a declaration. Grace used the credit card Aiden had arranged with caution, flinching each time she handed it over, as if the balance might vanish if she trusted it too much. Aiden noticed but didn't comment. Instead, he adjusted the plan subtly, keeping expenses sensible, choices grounded. On the fourth day, Grace asked to be taken somewhere she hadn't planned to revisit. The Women's Resource Center on 3rd Avenue was housed in a converted church, its stone facade weathered but dignified. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and disinfectant. Karen Delgado, the social worker who stepped out to greet her, was in her late 40s, sturdy with curly dark hair streaked with gray and a voice that carried warmth without softness. Her face shifted from surprise to relief to cautious joy in seconds. "Grace," Karen said, pulling her into a hug that smelled like mint and wool. "We were worried," Grace explained briefly, imperfectly. Karen listened, nodding, hands folded. "It happens fast," she said when Grace finished, "too fast for anyone to be ready." On the way out, Grace noticed a woman sitting near the entrance alcove, coat several sizes too large, hands raw from cold. The woman looked up, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. June Harlan had a face mapped with lines that spoke of stubborn endurance. Her hair was a thin gray halo under a knit cap, her posture guarded but proud. "You look different," June said bluntly, when recognition dawned, "like you found a door." Grace sat beside her without asking permission. They talked in fragments, shared roots and warnings. When Grace offered help, June bristled. "I don't take charity." "Neither do I," Grace said. "I take people." It took time, but June agreed to a few nights somewhere warm. Grace arranged a room nearby, separate from the house, respecting June's need for space. When June left, she squeezed Grace's hand once, hard. "You don't forget who you were," she said. It wasn't a question. Back at Maple Street, the house began to feel inhabited. Shoes by the door, crayon marks on scrap paper, Noah's toys migrating inexplicably. Grace cooked dinner and felt the strange, quiet fear of stability, the fear that it could be taken away just as easily as it arrived. That fear wasn't unfounded. On the 7th day, Aiden arrived with a look he hadn't worn before. He stood in the kitchen, fingers steepled, eyes careful. "There's been some attention," he said. "A journalist called the bank asking questions about an old trust activation. No names yet." Grace's stomach tightened. "What kind of questions?" "Enough to suggest someone talked," Aiden said. "We're managing it." Grace thought of the brass token, of doors opening and closing. She thought of how easily warmth attracted notice. Outside, the porch light flickered once, then steadied. That night, after Lily slept and Noah breathed evenly, Grace sat at the kitchen table and read Walter's letter again. She folded it carefully, placed it in a drawer, and listened to the house settle. Somewhere beyond the yard, tires hissed on wet pavement. Somewhere else, a phone rang and wasn't answered. Grace didn't know yet that a man who had waited decades for leverage had just found a rumor to pull. She only knew that the home she had chosen felt real, and that real things, once found, were often tested. Grace Parker learned quickly that stability had a sound. It was the low, reliable hum of a refrigerator at night, the click of the porch light when dusk fell, the soft thud of mail landing inside a box with her name on it. It was Lily's backpack resting by the door and Noah's breathing settling into a rhythm that no longer startled Grace awake. With stability came something else, an urge she hadn't planned for. Gratitude, once it stops aching, tends to look for somewhere to go. She returned to the Women's Resource Center on 3rd Avenue with groceries and quiet intention. Karen Delgado met her in the entryway, arms crossed, eyes sharp with affection and caution. Karen was built solidly, the kind of woman who had learned to anchor rooms with her presence. Her dark curls were streaked with gray, her skin warm brown and weathered by years of listening to other people's pain. She wore comfortable shoes and cardigans with frayed cuffs, evidence of work that never ended. "You don't have to do this," Karen said gently. "Not yet." "I know," Grace replied. "I just don't want to forget how this felt." They talked in Karen's cramped office, the walls lined with flyers and success stories pinned like talismans. Grace asked what was most needed. Karen answered with practiced honesty. Warm beds in winter, safe transitions, people willing to listen without trying to fix everything at once. Before Grace left, she wrote a check with a hand that shook only a little. That night, she arranged a hotel room for June Harlan No Strings, no speeches. June accepted with a grunt and a warning look that said pride was still intact. "A few nights," June said. "That's all." Grace agreed, because respect mattered more than timelines. A week later, a girl appeared at Grace's door with a backpack and eyes that never stayed still. Tessa Lane was 17, all angles and guarded posture, her hair dyed a defiant black that had grown out unevenly to reveal her natural light brown beneath. Her skin was pale, freckled across the nose, her mouth set in a way that suggested she'd learned early not to trust kindness. She spoke fast, words tumbling over each other like she was afraid silence might betray her. "Karen said you might help," she blurted. "Just for a bit." Grace noticed the bruises first faded yellow at the wrist, a newer purple blooming under the collarbone. "You're safe here," Grace said, and meant it in the way that carried rules. Tessa slept on the couch that night, shoes on, backpack clutched to her chest. Over tea the next morning, Tessa told her about the shelter volunteer who lingered too close, who asked questions that didn't belong to him, who made girls feel watched even when he wasn't in the room. Grace listened without interrupting, her jaw tight. She didn't promise justice. She promised caution. Grace didn't act loudly. She asked Aidan Brooks for names of investigators who worked discreetly. He sent one Mark Ellison, a former public defender turned private investigator, mid-50s, lean with a face permanently etched with skepticism. Mark dressed plainly and spoke little, but when he did, it was with precision sharpened by years of courtroom defeat and occasional wins. "Predators rely on noise and fear," he said. "Silence is harder for them." Statements were taken. Dates cross-checked. Tessa was moved to a safe location with counseling support arranged through Karen. Other girls came forward when they learned they wouldn't be exposed. The man at the center of it, Greg Mallory, a volunteer with a reputation for dedication, wasn't imposing. He was in his early 40s, clean-shaven, earnest-looking, with a habit of smiling too quickly. That smile collapsed under scrutiny. When the evidence was presented to the shelter's board and major donors, Greg was dismissed within days and reported to authorities. New safeguards were implemented quietly, effectively. The article appeared the following Monday. "From Sidewalk to Seven Figures," the headline read. The story danced around names but offered enough breadcrumbs to invite a hunt. Grace's phone vibrated constantly. Unknown numbers, blocked calls. A man stood at the end of Maple Street one afternoon pretending to check his watch, eyes too curious to be coincidence. Lily asked why strangers were looking at the house. Grace told her the truth in pieces. Sometimes people noticed things late and all at once. The bank called the next day. Aidan arrived with tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "There's an internal review," he said, choosing his words with care. "They're questioning the activation process." "Because of the article," Grace said. "Yes," Aidan replied, and because someone wants them to. The man leading the review introduced himself by phone later that afternoon. Charles Whitmore spoke with a voice that had been trained to soothe investors. He was in his early 60s, his hair silver and neatly combed, his features sharp in a way that suggested control more than kindness. When Grace met him days later in a glass-walled conference room at Keystone Federal, she noticed the way he smiled without involving his eyes. His handshake was brief, cool. "Ms. Parker," Whitmore said, "an extraordinary story." Grace returned the smile politely. "Extraordinary things happen when people plan for the worst." Whitmore's lips tightened. "We have a responsibility to ensure the integrity of our processes. This, trust your grandfathers, was unconventional." Richard Hale sat quietly at the end of the table, his presence steady but restrained. "There are concerns that the conditions for activation may not have been sufficiently verified. Until the review concludes, certain assets may need to be temporarily frozen." The word "froze" felt intentional. Aiden interjected calmly. "All protocols were followed." Whitmore raised a hand. "That will be determined." Afterward, in the elevator, Aiden exhaled. "I'm sorry," he said. "He's pushing." "Why?" Grace asked. She wasn't angry yet. She was alert. Aiden hesitated. "There's history." They met later that evening at Maple Street, after Lily was asleep and Noah's breathing was soft and even. Aiden sat at the kitchen table, hands folded. "Charles Whitmore's father lost a significant technology deal to your grandfather decades ago," he said. "It was legal, clean, but costly. The story became legend in that family. Opportunity stolen, fortune diverted." Grace thought of Walter Bennett clipping coupons, brewing bitter coffee. He never talked about it. "Men like Walter rarely do," Aiden said. "But men like Whitmore remember." The bank sent formal notice 2 days later. The review would proceed. Access would be limited. Grace felt the old cold brush her ribs, but she didn't let it take hold. She watched Lily color at the table. She held Noah and felt the steady beat of his heart. "What do we do?" she asked. "We protect your children," Aiden said, "and we protect the truth." Grace agreed to the DNA test without drama, not because she doubted who she was, but because she refused to let the system pretend uncertainty where none existed. The test was scheduled for Friday. On Thursday night, Grace stood on the porch and watched snow begin to fall, the flakes catching the light as if pausing mid-air. June called to say she'd found a room of her own, voice gruff with gratitude. Karen texted a simple heart. Inside, Tessa's backpack sat by the door, waiting for her next step. Grace felt the shape of the fight ahead forming, not just with a banker, but with a narrative that wanted her small again. At the lab the next morning, the technician, a woman with kind eyes and efficient hands, swabbed Grace's cheek, then Lily's, then Noah's. "Results in 48 hours, she said. Grace nodded. She stepped back into the cold and pulled her coat tight, the porch light at Maple Street waiting like a promise. Somewhere across town, a man named Whitmore waited too, convinced the winter would do what he always believed it did best. And she stood on it without stepping back. The wood-paneled conference room at Keystone Federal carried the smell of polish and old money, a place designed to slow the pulse and elevate authority. Grace Parker sat at the long table with her hands folded, posture straight, eyes steady. Across from her, the Trust Administration Committee arranged their papers with practiced neutrality. At the far end, Charles Whitmore leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, the faintest curl of impatience at his mouth. He looked immaculate as ever-tailored charcoal suit, silver hair combed precisely, a face carved by years of control. He had learned early that power didn't need to raise its voice. On the table lay the evidence, the DNA report with its crisp percentages, Lily's and Noah's birth certificates, photographs of Grace with her grandfather Walter Bennett at various ages, and the letter Walter had written in his looping hand. Richard Hale sat to Grace's left, shoulders squared, calm as a lighthouse. Aiden Brooks stood behind her chair, present without hovering, a quiet anchor. Whitmore spoke first, voice smooth. Ms. Parker's circumstances were unusual. Our duty is to ensure the bank is not exposed to reputational risk by extraordinary claims." Grace didn't flinch. When she spoke, her voice was low and even, shaped by nights when panic had to be swallowed so children could sleep. "Extraordinary circumstances don't invalidate truth," she said. "They reveal it." A murmur passed through the committee. Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly. Grace continued, not loudly, not defensively. She named the verification steps, the redundancies, the witnesses. She named the DNA result without triumph. Then she named something else. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, meeting his gaze, "you did not disclose your family's prior business conflict with my grandfather. That omission matters." The committee chair, a woman in her 50s with ash-blonde hair and an expression trained for fairness, looked up sharply. "Is that accurate, Mr. Whitmore?" Whitmore smiled thinly. "Ancient history. Irrelevant." "It's relevant," Grace said gently, "because this review was never about process. It was about a story you've been carrying since before I was born." Silence pressed in. Richard Hale cleared his throat. The trust activation complied fully with policy. Any suggestion otherwise is unsupported. The chairwoman reviewed the documents again, then nodded once. "The review is concluded," she said. "The trust is affirmed in full. All access is restored. Ms. Parker, the committee apologizes for the distress caused." Whitmore stood abruptly, chair legs scraping. "This isn't over," he said, voice cool. Grace looked at him, unafraid. "For me, it is." In the hallway afterward, Aidan exhaled a breath he'd been holding for weeks. "You were steady," he said. Grace felt the steadiness too, not as bravado, but as absence of fear. It surprised her. 6 months later, life no longer sounded like alarms. It sounded like Lily's shoes thumping down the stairs on school mornings, like Noah's laughter when he chased light through the living room, like the kettle clicking off at dusk. Maple Street had grown familiar in the way places do when they are allowed to hold you. The porch light came on every evening at the same time, not bright, just enough. Tessa Lane stayed. She cut her hair shorter, the black dye fading to a softer brown. The angles of her posture loosened. She enrolled in night classes and learned the rhythm of the house, when Lily needed help with spelling, when Noah needed a nap, when Grace needed quiet. She worked part-time at a bookstore and came home with paperbacks tucked under her arm like small victories. June Harlan moved into a senior apartment with a view of the river. She arrived every Sunday with a bag of rolls and a warning not to fuss. She took the corner chair at the table and watched the children with a softened eye. Pride remained, but it had room now. Grace met weekly with Dr. Elaine Harper, a trauma therapist recommended by Karen Delgado. Dr. Harper was tall and spare, silver hair worn in a low bun, skin pale and translucent like porcelain held up to light. She spoke carefully, listened more. "Survivor's guilt," she said once, "not as a diagnosis, but as a map. It tells you you're cheating the past when you choose comfort. We'll teach it a different language." They did, slowly. Grace learned that peace didn't erase memory. It coexisted with it. Grace used the trust the way Walter would have approved, quietly, with intention. A medical relief fund for families crushed by hospital bills. A housing transition program designed to bridge the gap between shelter and stability. None bore her name. She measured success by outcomes, not plaques. One autumn morning, Grace drove to the cemetery on the east side of town. The grass was damp with dew, the air carrying the smell of leaves and distant wood smoke. Walter Bennett's headstone was modest, the inscription simple. Grace set a small potted fern at its base and stood for a moment, hands in her coat pockets. "I'm protecting what matters," she said softly. "Not just us." On the way back, she stopped at a light near the river and noticed an older man struggling with the hood of an ancient sedan. He was thin, shoulders rounded, face lined but open. Samuel Price introduced himself when Grace offered help. Early 60s, gray beard, trimmed short, eyes tired but alert. His hands were oil-stained, his voice careful with pride. He spoke of a daughter in community college, of applications unanswered. Grace listened, recognized the edge of the cliff he stood on. She wrote down his number. "I may know of something," she said. No promises. That evening the house filled with ordinary sounds. Tessa read at the table. Lily practiced piano. Noah slept sprawled like a starfish. Grace stood on the porch and watched the light come on, the quiet glow that said, "Here." Weeks later, the newspaper ran a small correction on page 6, acknowledging the bank's error. There was no apology headline, no parade. Whitmore quietly retired amid an ethics review. Life did not announce its resolutions. Grace preferred it that way. On a winter night, as snow dusted the yard, Lily asked a question that stopped Grace mid-step. "Mom," she said, "are we rich?" Grace considered the porch light, the table, the warmth. "We have enough," she said, "and that means we take care." Lily nodded, satisfied. Noah slept on. Grace turned off the light when she went inside, knowing it would come back on tomorrow, as it always did. Quiet as a promise, bright enough to guide anyone who needed to find their way home.